So I tried using a 2022 mid-range phone in 2024. And guess what? It's totally fine. You might be wondering, why? Why review a phone from 2 years ago when there are clearly more phones now at a different price points? Well, for one, smartphones are getting pricier and pricier. So some of you are probably looking at a phone from a year ago. Although most phones from yesteryears are still worth buying today, I just happen to have a Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus here, which is actually still compelling compared to most mid-range phones today when you see the spec sheet. When this came out back in April of 2023 in the Philippines, it cost 22,000 pesos for the sole model of 8 GB, 256 GB. Today, you can get a second-hand model for around 17 to 18,000 pesos, although technically this phone was launched in China in October 22. Regardless, phones like the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus are still not as common as you think, thanks to the two headlining features, that 200 megapixel camera and that 120-watt charging speed. The rest of the specs are still relevant and good for today's standards, like the Dimensity 1080 chipset, the large 120Hz AMOLED display, and dual speakers. Obviously, newer, similarly priced phones are better in some ways, but like I said, that 200 megapixel and 120-watt combo is still not as common as you might think. We will discuss all of those later on, but the most important thing to know here about this phone is the quality of the camera. Does it have what it takes to be better or at least compete against the newer mid-range phones today? The short answer to that is yes. I made this phone my main Android phone for a few weeks, and yes, I am happy with the quality of the photos and videos, especially in perfect lighting. So the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus has a Samsung 200 megapixel sensor alongside an 8 megapixel ultra-wide in the back. By default though, you're getting 12 megapixel photos from the main camera. While you can still capture full 200 megapixel photos and even 50 megapixel photos, this is not always the best option. Additionally, I found one trick in fixing that overly bright output from Android phones when taking photos. Instead of shooting in photo mode, which is the default shooting mode of the app, I shoot in pro mode. I have everything in auto except for the exposure, which I set at -7 when using the main camera and -3 in ultrawide. The ultrawide camera tends to have a more balanced exposure than the main camera, so at times I switch the exposure between -3 and 0 depending on the conditions. Yes, they do make the photos less bright than usual, but this is a good practice in getting balanced looking photos, giving you more control over the way you want your photos to look, feel, and stand out. As a result, I get way sharper photos thanks to the lower ISO setting, more contrast, and more accurate colors. I also like the fact that the look of the ultra-wide and wide are nearly the same in terms of colors, which is a good thing if you want accuracy and consistency across your photos. Also, I like the fact that this ultra-wide lens is actually decent. Sure, it's only 8 megapixel, but it doesn't really look excessively soft compared to other ultra-wide cameras I've tested recently. At this point, I might sound like I'm overly praising this phone, but there are a couple of things to take note of. The dynamic range is understandably limited with this phone, such is the case with other mid-range phones as well. Meaning you won't always get all the details in the darkest part of an image, especially in the shadows. And when HDR does kick in, to my eyes, there's just a little bit of over HDR processing that takes place, and I can see it from the softer color shades. It's not a big deal, but I just don't like my photos looking over processed. When it comes to limited lighting, you have to pick your shots when relying on indoor lighting. Any mid-range phone struggles with indoor lighting, and that's still true here. The camera doesn't totally ruin the shots, but there's definitely a reduction in sharpness, and sometimes they can look like painting. So watch out for that. Lastly, if you want to take in zoomed-in photos, I highly recommend turning on 50 megapixel in Pro mode or switching to 200 megapixel mode because it preserves the details and sharpness in the photos. The difference is night and day. Just make sure you have a good amount of lighting. A good practice is shooting in 200 megapixel when there's studio lighting or in broad daylight, while 50 megapixel is good enough in limited lighting. As for videos, I also shoot in Pro mode in the same conditions when taking photos. As a result, it's just better. What you get from photos is what you get from videos as well. I will say though that OIS in newer phones is much better than this phone. That's not to say that this is bad though, the new ones are just better. Basically, the 200 megapixel camera of the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus is straight up competitive even after more than a year. I would even say that this is better than most mid-range phones right now. Premium mid-range phones like this are usually coupled with better image processing from the developers, so even if there's a newer phone but not in the category of a premium mid-range phone, chances are you're going to get better photos with this older phone, unless you're a Google Pixel, of course. But what's the use of a good camera if the performance of a phone is bad, right? The good thing here is that the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus continues to hold up pretty well by today's standards. Outside gaming, this phone just flies when it comes to the regular day-to-day task of a user. There are hardly any lags or stutters to notice here, and one of the things I usually like to do is play 4K videos on YouTube just because I want all that pixels as much as possible. However, the phone will slow down when you try to multitask while a 4K YouTube video is playing. It's a small thing, but what you really need to pay attention to is if you're a gamer. The Dimensity 1080 is no gaming chipset, but it can still play older titles with ease. But if you're aiming to play newer titles, especially open world games or realistic looking games like Warzone Mobile, it's going to be hard to enjoy those games here. In my case though, I've been playing PS2 emulators recently. I was actually playing my emulator on the Nova 11 with Snapdragon 778G, and it ran just fine even with upscaled resolution, but with the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus, the emulator struggled to keep the game running smoothly even though I was hitting consistent 30 to 50 frames. I don't think it's the chipset because this has the power to play emulators. I think Qualcomm chipsets are just better optimized for emulated games than MediaTek's. Hopefully that changes soon, but as far as RAM goes, 8GB still remains the standard in ensuring smooth performance when there are several apps open, and considering this phone has received the latest HyperOS from Xiaomi, I must say that 8GB is still the sweetest spot for Xiaomi phones. Do take note that this started with Android 12 out of the box, and now it's running Android 14. That's already 2 years worth of software upgrades. When this launched, the promise of long-term software support was not that common in Android phones. So when it comes to that, the chances of this phone getting Android 15 is 50-50. I do expect security patches to arrive until the third year of this phone or until Xiaomi announces something about it. But assuming this is the last software upgrade, I actually don't mind because the performance is smooth and stable with this Android version. And I'm still going to receive security patches for at least a year. The battery though, despite having a 5000 mAh cell, is acceptable at best. It's not quick to drain or deplete, but I consistently get a solid 5 hours of screen time every single day. That's without playing games, just purely browsing and watching videos. In other words, it's an all-day battery, but if you use your phone extremely, for example, you're always on data connection, using GPS, playing games, and all that heavy sort of stuff, you're going to need to top up before a day ends. However, the good thing is that 120-watt charger is as reliable as ever. Plug this into its charger, give it 15 to 20 minutes, and you're already back at 100%. It's so convenient to have this feature despite not being heavily marketed by companies. But like I said, there's not a lot of phones with 120-watt charger as well as a 5000 mAh cell. As far as the display goes, the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus is definitely better than most mid-range AMOLED phones today. 6.7 inches flat panel is still relatively large today, and despite not having eye-blinding peak brightness levels like the newer phones, 900 nits is plenty bright for both indoors and outdoors. One thing that really stands out here though, even if it's not as technically impressive as other phones, is the color calibration. I've tested other phones with AMOLED displays, but for some reason, those felt like the colors were a bit off. The white balance was a bit off. There's just something with the way Xiaomi calibrates the screen out of the box. Oh, and before I forget, this large phone still has a headphone jack. Although the screen does not sport a fingerprint scanner, the side-mounted scanner is still faster and more reliable in unlocking this phone. For 2024, the Redmi Note 12 Pro Plus is not a bad phone. Basically, it got the fundamentals right when it comes to owning a dependent daily driver. The thing where it falls short is higher peak brightness in display, but that's not really something a regular user looks for in a phone. And again, this phone is plenty bright already. Second, the software support. Since it's only this year that we're seeing extended software upgrades from manufacturers. Aside from those two, I don't see any problem with this phone as a daily driver for the next 1, 2, 3 years. That's it for this one. Drop a sub or like if you feel like supporting the channel. And as always, until the next one, stay safe.